Story 1. The rain began without warning. Fat droplets splattered against the windshield of Sam's car as he squinted at the empty stretch of road ahead. It was supposed to be a straightforward drive through the countryside to his aunt's cabin. But now, with the storm raging and visibility reduced to a murky blur, Sam knew he needed to pull over. Just as he decided to search for a safe spot, the dim glow of a neon sign emerged from the haze. The Whispering Inn. It seemed out of place. This lonely inn perched beside the winding road. Its sign flickered like an unsteady heartbeat. But to Sam, it was a beacon of hope. As he turned into the gravel driveway, the crunching of his tires was drowned out by a rumble of thunder that rolled across the darkened sky. The inn looked ancient, its wooden exterior warped with time. The windows glowed faintly with a warm, inviting light. Sam grabbed his duffel bag and dashed through the rain to the entrance. He pushed open the heavy oak door and was greeted by the scent of old wood and a faint, sweet aroma that he couldn't quite place. Behind the reception desk stood a woman with silver hair pulled back into a tight bun. Her sharp eyes gleamed as she regarded Sam with a mixture of curiosity and amusement. "Caught in the storm, are we?" she asked, her voice smooth and calm. "Yeah, I was hoping to find shelter until it clears up," Sam replied, shaking water from his jacket. She handed him an old-fashioned key attached to a brass plate engraved with the number 7. "Room 7, third door on the left upstairs. Dinner is served at 8. Welcome to the Whispering Inn." Sam's room was cozy but antiquated. The furniture was heavy and dark, and the wallpaper, though once vibrant, had faded into muted tones of green and gold. A 4-poster bed dominated the room, its canopy swaying slightly as though stirred by an invisible breeze. As he unpacked his bag, Sam noticed a peculiar detail. The mirror above the dresser was covered with a thick black cloth. Curious, he reached to uncover it but stopped when he felt a sudden chill creep up his spine. The storm outside seemed to grow louder, the howling wind mingling with faint whispers that he couldn't quite make out. Dismissing the unease as exhaustion, Sam lay on the bed and stared at the ceiling. The whispers grew louder, forming fragmented words that seemed to echo from the walls. He sat up abruptly, his heart pounding. "Hello?" he called out. Silence. Then, as if in response, the whispers began again, this time clearer. "Don't uncover the mirror." Shaken but determined to ignore his growing fear, Sam decided to head down for dinner. The dining room was a large hall with a roaring fireplace and a long table set for guests. Only 4 other people were present, each one as peculiar as the next. There was an elderly man with a monocle who introduced himself as Mr. Winslow. A young woman named Clara who seemed unnervingly cheerful. A stern-faced businessman named Mr. Hargrove. And a timid girl who remained silent throughout the introductions. As the meal progressed, Sam noticed strange dynamics among the guests. Mr. Winslow kept glancing nervously at the windows. Clara hummed an eerie tune under her breath, and Mr. Hargrove seemed agitated by any mention of the storm. The silent girl avoided eye contact, her hands trembling as she ate. "How long has this inn been here?" Sam asked, trying to ease the tension. "Longer than it should," Mr. Winslow muttered, earning a sharp glare from Clara. Before Sam could press further, the innkeeper entered the room, her presence commanding immediate silence. "Enjoy your meal," she said, her gaze lingering on Sam. "And remember, the rules of the Whispering Inn are not to be broken. Later that night, unable to shake the lingering whispers, Sam decided to confront the mystery head-on. Returning to his room, he stood before the covered mirror. The words of the whispers echoed in his mind. Don't uncover the mirror. But curiosity won. Slowly, he pulled away the cloth, revealing the tarnished surface beneath. At first, the reflection was ordinary, showing only Sam and his dimly lit room. Then, the image began to distort. Faces appeared behind him, their hollow eyes staring through the glass. One face leaned closer, its lips moving silently before a chilling voice echoed in his mind. You shouldn't have looked. The door slammed shut behind him, and the whispers erupted into a deafening cacophony. The next morning, Sam's bed was empty, his belongings untouched. At breakfast, the other guests avoided discussing his absence, their eyes filled with unspoken fear. Meanwhile, a new guest arrived, drenched from the storm. As the innkeeper handed over a brass key engraved with the number 7, her lips curled into a faint smile. Welcome to the Whispering Inn, she said. Story 2, the lighthouse at Black Rock Cove was a solitary figure against the endless expanse of the ocean, its towering frame battered by salt-laden winds and the relentless crash of waves. To Marie, it was both intimidating and enchanting. She stood at the base of the cliff, staring up at the white and black striped structure, as the fading light of the day painted the sky in hues of orange and crimson. Marie had been hired to catalogue the old keeper's journals, a job she eagerly accepted. After years of desk work, the idea of spending time in a remote, historic location felt like a dream, or so she thought. As she climbed the winding path to the lighthouse, her suitcase bumping along the rocky ground, an inexplicable sense of unease settled over her. The lighthouse keeper, Mr. Grayson, was waiting for her at the top of the cliff. He was a wiry old man with a weathered face and sharp, piercing eyes. He greeted her with a curt nod, his voice gravelly from years of shouting over the wind. You're here for the journals, he said, not as a question, but as a statement. That's right, Marie replied, trying to sound cheerful. Good, follow me. The inside of the lighthouse was cramped but functional. The air smelled of oil and salt, and the walls were lined with shelves crammed with books, maps, and nautical tools. Mr. Grayson led her to a small room on the second floor, where a desk and an oil lamp awaited her. You'll find the journals here, he said, pointing to a battered chest. Start with the oldest and work your way forward. And whatever you do, stay out of the light room after dark. Marie raised an eyebrow. Why? He didn't answer. Instead, he turned and began climbing the spiral staircase to the top of the lighthouse, his footsteps echoing in the narrow space. Left alone, Marie unpacked her things and prepared for a long night of work. The journals were a treasure trove of history, chronicling decades of life at Black Rock Cove. The earliest entries, written in careful script, describe the construction of the lighthouse and the storms that battered it in its early years. As she read, Marie felt a growing admiration for the keepers who had braved isolation and danger to keep the light burning. But as she progressed, the tone of the entries began to change. By the third journal, the writing became erratic, filled with accounts of strange occurrences. One keeper described hearing whispers in the night, while another claimed to see shadowy figures moving through the light room. The final entry in one journal simply read, "The light calls to them. I can't keep it out." Marie shivered and closed the book. The wind howled outside, and she pulled her sweater tighter around her shoulders. She glanced at the staircase leading to the light room, her curiosity battling the warning Mr. Grayson had given her. As the clock struck midnight, Marie's resolve wavered. She couldn't shake the feeling that the answers to the strange entries lay in the light room. Grabbing her flashlight, she ascended the spiral staircase, the steps creaking under her weight. The light room was smaller than she expected, dominated by the massive Fresnel lens that refracted light into brilliant patterns. It rotated slowly, casting shifting beams across the walls. But something about the room felt wrong. The air was colder, and the shadows seemed to move on their own. Marie approached the lens, her breath fogging in the chill. As she peered into the glass, she saw a reflection that wasn't her own. A gaunt, pale face stared back at her, its hollow eyes filled with despair. She stumbled back, her flashlight clattering to the floor. The whispers began then, soft and insistent. "Join us." The next morning, Marie confronted Mr. Grayson. "What's in the light room?" she demanded. He didn't answer immediately. Instead, he poured himself a cup of black coffee and sat down at the kitchen table. "You looked, didn't you?" he said finally. Marie nodded, her hands trembling. "The light isn't just for guiding ships," he said, his voice heavy with regret. "It's a barrier, keeps things out, and sometimes keeps things in. The keepers before me tried to fight it, but the light has a will of its own." "What happens if it's turned off?" Marie asked. Mr. Grayson's expression darkened. "Pray you never find out." That night Marie couldn't sleep. The whispers had followed her from the light room, growing louder with each passing hour. They called her name, promising answers, promising peace. She tried to block them out, but it was no use. At 3 a.m., she found herself climbing the stairs again. The light room was darker this time, the lens barely turning. As she stepped inside, the whispers ceased, replaced by an overwhelming silence. Then the lens stopped entirely, and the room was plunged into darkness. From the shadows, figures emerged, tall, gaunt, and featureless. They moved toward her, their presence suffocating. Marie screamed, but no sound escaped her lips. And then the light flared back to life, blinding and pure. The figures recoiled, melting into the walls. Marie collapsed to the floor, gasping for air. The next morning, Mr. Grayson found Marie packed and ready to leave. "You can't leave," he said. "Watch me," she replied, her voice shaking. As she drove away from Black Rock Cove, she glanced in her rearview mirror. The lighthouse stood tall against the horizon, its light a steady beacon. But as she rounded the bend, she saw something else. Figures standing on the cliff, watching her go. The whispers stayed with her long after she left, echoing in her mind as she tried to forget the secrets of the lighthouse. Story 3. The letter arrived on a gloomy morning, delivered by a courier who left without a word. Emma stared at the envelope, her name scrawled across the front in an elegant, old-fashioned script. The paper was thick and yellowed, the kind used decades ago. She turned it over, revealing a crimson wax seal embossed with the words, "Ravenwood Institute." Emma's hands trembled as she broke the seal. The letter inside was brief but chilling. "Dear Miss Harper, you are cordially invited to participate in the final documentation of Ravenwood Asylum before its demolition. Your reputation as an investigative journalist precedes you, and we believe you are the perfect candidate for this project. Accommodations will be provided. Please arrive by dusk tomorrow." Best regards, Dr. Alaric Gray, Ravenwood Asylum. The name alone sent a shiver down her spine. Abandoned for over 50 years, it was infamous for the mysterious disappearances of its patients and staff. Emma had always been fascinated by unsolved mysteries. But this felt different, personal even. Still, the promise of an exclusive story was too tempting to pass up. The next evening, she found herself driving through a desolate stretch of forest, Ravenwood's silhouette looming in the distance. The building was massive, its Gothic architecture standing in stark contrast to the encroaching wilderness. The setting sun cast long shadows across its cracked facade, and Emma's unease grew with every step toward the heavy double doors. Inside, the air was thick with the scent of mildew and decay. The grand foyer, once a testament to the asylum's grandeur, was now a hollow shell. Dust-covered chandeliers hung precariously from the ceiling, and broken furniture littered the marble floors. A man emerged from the shadows, startling Emma. He was tall and thin, his sharp features accentuated by the dim light of a lantern he held. "Miss Harper, I presume?" he said, his voice smooth but distant. "Dr. Gray?" she replied, her voice wavering. He nodded and gestured for her to follow. As they walked, he explained the purpose of her visit. "Ravenwood has a troubled history," he began. "But before it's torn down, we aim to preserve its story. You will have full access to the facility tonight. However, I must warn you, the asylum has its peculiarities." Emma stopped in her tracks. "What do you mean by peculiarities?" Dr. Gray's expression darkened. "You'll understand soon enough." Armed with her notebook and flashlight, Emma began her exploration. The asylum was a labyrinth of decaying hallways and locked doors. Her footsteps echoed eerily, accompanied only by the occasional drip of water from unseen leaks. She found the first file in what remained of the administrative office. It detailed the case of a patient named Margaret Hayes, who had been admitted for claiming to hear voices. According to the notes, Margaret's condition deteriorated rapidly, and she vanished without a trace just days before the asylum's closure. The whispers started shortly after Emma read Margaret's file. Faint and indistinct at first, they grew louder as she moved deeper into the asylum. They seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere all at once, carrying fragmented words she couldn't quite piece together. "Hello," she called out, her voice trembling. The whispers ceased. Then from the corner of her eye, she saw a shadow dart across the hallway. She spun around, but the corridor was empty. Emma's search led her to the solarium, a massive room with floor-to-ceiling windows now caked with grime. The moonlight barely penetrated the darkness, casting long, distorted shadows across the tiled floor. At the center of the room was a chair, bolted to the ground and surrounded by deep scratches in the tiles. As she approached, she noticed a recorder lying on the floor. It was old but functional. She pressed play, and a distorted voice crackled to life. "The light. It burns them. Keep it on. Don't let it go out." The recording ended abruptly, and the room grew colder. The whispers returned, louder this time, accompanied by faint sobs. Emma backed away, her flashlight flickering. Suddenly the chair scraped against the floor, as though moved by an invisible force. Emma screamed and fled the room, her heart pounding in her chest. Breathless and terrified, Emma found Dr. Gray in the foyer. "This place is haunted," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. Dr. Gray looked at her with a mixture of pity and resignation. Ravenwood's past is darker than you know, he said. The patients weren't insane. They were tormented by something otherworldly. The asylum was built to contain it, not cure them. Emma's blood ran cold. Why didn't you tell me? Would you have come if I had? He replied. Before she could respond, a loud crash echoed through the building, followed by the sound of shattering glass. Dr. Gray grabbed her arm. We need to leave. Now. The asylum seemed to come alive as they ran. Doors slammed shut on their own, and shadows writhed across the walls. The whispers had become a deafening chorus, screaming unintelligible words. They reached the main doors, but they wouldn't budge. Dr. Gray produced a key, his hands shaking as he struggled to unlock the massive lock. Behind them, the shadows coalesced into a humanoid form. Its featureless face contorted in silent rage. The lock clicked, and the doors burst open. They stumbled outside. The cold night air, a stark contrast to the oppressive atmosphere of the asylum. As they drove away, Emma glanced back. Ravenwood stood silhouetted against the moonlight, its windows glowing faintly. She could still hear the whispers, faint but persistent, as though they had followed her. Story 4. It was on a foggy evening when Claire first stumbled upon the shop. The wooden sign above the door creaked in the wind, its faded letters spelling out Elliot's Antiques and Curiosities. She had passed the street countless times before, but had never noticed the store. Drawn by a strange sense of curiosity, Claire pushed open the heavy oak door, the bell above jingling softly. Inside, the air was thick with the scent of old wood and leather. Shelves lined the walls, packed with peculiar items, tarnished silverware, cracked porcelain dolls, and faded paintings. At the center of the room stood an ornate grandfather clock, its golden pendulum swinging in slow, deliberate arcs. "You have an eye for the unique," a voice rasped behind her. Claire turned to see an elderly man with a gaunt face and thin, wiry spectacles perched on his nose. His hands, calloused and gnarled, rested on the counter. "I'm Elliot. This clock," he said, gesturing to the grandfather clock, "is one of a kind. It's said to have been crafted by a cursed clockmaker." "Cursed," Claire repeated, raising an eyebrow. Elliot smiled faintly, his teeth yellowed with age. "Legends say he built clocks that could trap time itself. This one is special. It's said to connect to other times, other places. But beware, it has rules. If you don't follow them, you'll regret it." Claire couldn't help but laugh. Sounds like a great story to sell an old clock. Elliot's expression darkened. "It's not a story. Would you like to see for yourself?" Despite her better judgment, Claire found herself purchasing the clock. It was delivered to her apartment the next day, its presence dominating her small living room. The intricate carvings on its wooden frame seemed almost alive, shifting in the dim light. That evening, as the city's noises faded and the room grew quiet, Claire approached the clock. Her fingers brushed the cold brass of the winding key. On impulse, she turned it once. The room seemed to ripple, the air growing dense. The pendulum's swing slowed, then stopped entirely. Claire's surroundings changed, melting into a different place. She stood in a darkened room filled with cobwebs and broken furniture. The air was thick with dust, and the faint sound of footsteps echoed in the distance. Panic set in as Claire realized she was no longer in her apartment. Before she could move, the pendulum began to swing again, and she was abruptly returned to her living room. Her heart pounded in her chest as she stared at the clock, its golden hands ticking innocently. The next day, Claire returned to the shop, clock in hand. Elliot's expression turned grim when he saw her. "You turned the key, didn't you?" he asked. Claire nodded. "What happened? Where did I go?" "The clock doesn't just tell time," Elliot explained. "It opens doors to other moments, other realities, but it's not safe. There are rules you must follow. Never turn the key more than once in a day. Never wind it at midnight, and most importantly, never stop the pendulum." "What happens if I break the rules?" Claire asked, her voice barely a whisper. Elliot's gaze was piercing. "You don't want to know." For weeks, Claire obeyed the rules, using the clock sparingly and only during the day. Each turn of the key revealed glimpses of the past. A bustling Victorian marketplace, a quiet battlefield at dawn, a candle-lit ball filled with ghostly dancers. But one night, consumed by curiosity, Claire couldn't resist the urge to wind the clock at midnight. The pendulum froze, and the room plunged into darkness. When the world around her reappeared, she was in a dimly lit chamber filled with mirrors. Her reflection stared back at her, but it didn't move as she did. The whispers began then, soft at first but growing louder. They came from the mirrors, voices pleading and accusing. "Why did you come?" one voice hissed. "You broke the rules," another whispered. Claire turned to run, but the mirrors stretched infinitely, trapping her in an endless maze. Her reflections began to move on their own, their expressions twisting into malevolent grins. Claire's screams echoed as she found herself back in her apartment, the clock's pendulum swinging erratically. She ran to the shop, clutching the key in her hand. Elliot was waiting, his face pale. "I warned you," he said. "Now you've awakened them." "Awakened what?" Claire demanded. "The souls the clock has trapped over centuries," Elliot replied. "The clockmaker's curse wasn't just on the clocks. It was on anyone who used them. You must stop the pendulum to end it, but doing so comes at a price." Desperate, Claire returned home and stood before the clock. The pendulum's swing had become erratic, each tick echoing like a heartbeat. She reached out, grasping the pendulum firmly. It resisted, almost alive, but she pulled until it stopped. The room filled with a deafening silence, followed by a rush of cold air. The whispers ceased, and the clock began to crumble, its wooden frame collapsing into dust. Claire fell to her knees, gasping for breath. But as she looked around, she realized she wasn't in her apartment anymore. The room was unfamiliar, the walls lined with clocks, all ticking in unison, and in the corner stood a figure, its face obscured, holding a winding key identical to hers. The figure spoke, its voice low and chilling. "Welcome to your new role, Keeper of Time." Story 5. It was a bitterly cold night when Oliver boarded the train. The platform was deserted, save for a few stray pigeons huddled under the eaves of the station. His breath misted in the frosty air as he examined his ticket, which bore an unfamiliar destination, Hollow Junction. The train appeared out of nowhere, its arrival silent and sudden. The carriages were old-fashioned, their brass fixtures gleaming under the flickering station lights. Oliver hesitated, but the chilling wind urged him forward. He stepped onto the train, the conductor's face obscured by the brim of his hat. "Ticket, sir?" the conductor asked, his gloved hand extended. Oliver handed over the ticket, which the conductor inspected before nodding. "Welcome aboard. Please take any seat." The train's interior was eerily pristine, with plush velvet seats and ornate lamps glowing softly. Despite the warmth of the carriage, Oliver felt a shiver run down his spine. He chose a seat by the window and watched as the station faded into the darkness. The train began to move, its wheels clicking rhythmically against the tracks. That was when he noticed something strange. The other passengers, they were all silent, their faces pale and devoid of expression. Each person stared straight ahead, as if lost in some unseen world. After an hour of the train's steady journey, Oliver grew restless. He decided to explore the carriages. As he walked, the oppressive silence followed him. The other passengers didn't react to his movement, their vacant eyes fixed in place. He found the conductor at the far end of the train, standing by a door marked "Do Not Enter." "Excuse me," Oliver said. "Where exactly is this train heading?" The conductor's head tilted slightly. "Hollow Junction," he replied. "And where is that?" "You'll know when we arrive," the conductor said cryptically. "But be careful, sir. The train. It doesn't stop for everyone." Before Oliver could ask what he meant, the conductor gestured for him to return to his seat. Uneasy, Oliver obeyed, but his mind raced with questions. What kind of train was this? And why did the other passengers seem more like mannequins than people? Later that night, Oliver's curiosity got the better of him. He ventured toward the "Do Not Enter" door. The conductor was nowhere to be seen, and the door creaked open at his touch. Beyond it lay a dark, unlit carriage. The air inside was freezing, and an overwhelming sense of dread washed over him. The shadows seemed to move, writhing along the walls like living things. Oliver's flashlight revealed rows of empty seats, but as he moved deeper into the carriage, he saw faint outlines of figures, translucent shapes barely distinguishable from the gloom. A whisper broke the silence. "Leave." Oliver froze. The voice was soft yet commanding, echoing through the carriage. As he turned to leave, he saw a figure standing at the far end. A tall, shadowy form with glowing eyes. The figure raised an arm, and the door behind Oliver slammed shut. Oliver awoke in his seat, his heart pounding. He couldn't remember how he had returned, but the train was still moving. The other passengers remained as lifeless as before, and the conductor was nowhere in sight. Desperate for answers, Oliver searched his pockets and found the ticket. New words had appeared on its surface. One way. A chill ran down his spine as he realized the train's true purpose. Hollow Junction wasn't a place. It was a passage, a terminal for lost souls. The conductor reappeared, his expression somber. "You've seen too much," he said. "Now you must decide. Stay on the train or face what lies at Hollow Junction." Oliver's mind raced. Stay on the train forever, a prisoner of its endless journey? Or disembark at a destination that promised the unknown? Or worse? The train began to slow, its wheels screeching against the tracks. Outside the window, a bleak, colorless landscape stretched into infinity. Hollow Junction was no station but a void, a place where time and space seemed to unravel. As the train came to a halt, the conductor opened the door. "It's time," he said. Oliver hesitated, then stepped off the train. The air was heavy, each breath feeling like a weight on his chest. The other passengers followed, their forms dissolving into the mist as they entered the void. Oliver stood alone, the train disappearing behind him. A voice broke the silence, deep and resonant. "Welcome, traveler. You are free to wander, but never to return." Years later, a new passenger boarded the train. The platform was deserted, and the conductor, his face now obscured by shadows, welcomed them aboard. In his hand was a ticket marked one way. The train resumed its endless journey. its passengers silent and unmoving. And at the far end of the train, in the shadowy carriage, a figure sat alone, staring out into the void. His name had been Oliver, but now he was just another phantom aboard the phantom train. Story 6. It was a tradition in the town of Hollow Creek to warn newcomers about the woods. The dense forest that bordered the eastern edge of the town was shrouded in superstition and fear. Generations of townsfolk shared tales of those who ventured into the woods and never returned. They called it the Whispering Forest for the strange sounds that seemed to emanate from its depths. Soft murmurs that sounded like voices but never formed coherent words. Catherine had moved to Hollow Creek for a fresh start, leaving behind the chaos of city life. The stories of the cursed woods intrigued her, but didn't scare her. She was an avid hiker and had explored many forests before. The townsfolk's warnings only made her more curious. One misty morning, armed with her map, water bottle, and a sturdy pair of boots, Catherine decided to explore the edges of the forest. She assured herself she wouldn't go too deep, just enough to satisfy her curiosity. But as she followed the winding path into the woods, the mist thickened, and the sound of whispers began to surround her. The path soon disappeared, swallowed by the undergrowth. Catherine found herself surrounded by towering trees, their branches forming an intricate canopy that blocked out the sun. She stopped to catch her breath, leaning against a tree marked with strange symbols carved into its bark. She traced the markings with her fingers, feeling an odd warmth emanating from them. The whispers grew louder, and she thought she could hear her name. "Catherine," a voice hissed. She spun around, heart pounding, but saw nothing. The forest was silent now, save for the faint rustling of leaves. Despite her unease, she pressed on, determined to find the source of the voices. After what felt like hours, Catherine stumbled upon a clearing. In the center stood an ancient stone altar, moss-covered and cracked with age. Surrounding the altar were more of the marked trees, their symbols glowing faintly in the dim light. As she approached the altar, the whispers returned, louder and more insistent. The air grew colder, and Catherine felt an inexplicable pull toward the stones. She reached out to touch the altar, but as her fingers brushed its surface, a blinding light erupted, and the whispers turned to screams. Catherine staggered back, her vision swimming. When she looked up, she was no longer alone. Shadowy figures surrounded the clearing, their forms barely distinguishable from the darkness. One of the figures stepped forward, its form solidifying into a tall, hooded being. Its voice was deep and resonant, cutting through the chaos of whispers. "You should not be here," it said. Catherine's throat was dry, but she managed to whisper, "Who are you?" "I am the guardian of the forest," it replied. "This is sacred ground, and you have trespassed." "I didn't mean to," she said. "I just wanted to explore." The guardian's hooded head tilted. "Curiosity is a dangerous thing. You have seen what is forbidden. The forest does not forgive." The guardian raised a hand, and the whispers ceased. The other shadowy figures stepped back, their forms dissolving into the mist. "There is only one way to leave this place," the guardian said. "You must make a choice. Carry the burden of the forest's secrets or remain here forever." "What burden?" Catherine asked. "The forest demands a keeper, someone to guard its secrets and ensure no one else trespasses. If you accept, you will be bound to this place for eternity." Catherine's mind raced. The idea of staying in the forest forever terrified her, but so did the thought of leaving it behind, haunted by its whispers for the rest of her life. In the end, Catherine chose to stay. The guardian stepped aside, and the altar began to glow once more. Catherine approached it, feeling its warmth spread through her as the symbols etched into the trees pulsed in unison. As the light faded, Catherine felt a transformation. The whispers no longer filled her mind, but became a part of her. She could sense the forest's presence, its ancient power flowing through her veins. When she turned, the guardian was gone. The forest was silent, save for the rustling of leaves. Catherine stood alone in the clearing, her curiosity replaced with a solemn understanding. The next morning, the townsfolk of Hollow Creek noticed something strange. The whispers from the forest had stopped, but those who ventured too close swore they saw a figure among the trees, watching and waiting, ensuring no one ever crossed the threshold again. Story 7. The posters began appearing overnight, plastered to lampposts and walls around town. Brightly colored and slightly tattered, they announced the arrival of La Foire Mystique, a traveling carnival unlike any other. One night only, the posters read in bold swirling letters. The date was set for the following Saturday, at the edge of the old miller's field. Sam, an avid thrill-seeker, couldn't resist. Despite the townsfolk whispering about the carnival's mysterious reputation, he convinced his best friend, Mia, to come along. "It's just a carnival," Sam said, brushing off her hesitation. "What's the worst that could happen?" On the night of the carnival, a thick fog blanketed the field. The faint sound of a calliope echoed through the air, beckoning them closer. The carnival gates loomed ahead, decorated with flickering lights that cast strange shadows. A man in a top hat and a crimson coat greeted them, his sharp smile unnerving. "Welcome to La Foire Mystique," he said, bowing deeply. "Enjoy the night of your lives." Inside the carnival was a sensory overload. Bright lights and vivid colors clashed against the darkness of the night. Strange performers wandered through the crowd, a contortionist whose limbs twisted impossibly, a fire eater who exhaled flames that danced in mesmerizing patterns, and a fortune teller whose crystal ball seemed to glow with an inner light. Sam and Mia were drawn to a ride called the Labyrinth of Lights. The entrance was a swirling vortex of multicolored bulbs, and a sign promised an experience like no other. They handed their tickets to the operator, a pale man with eyes that seemed to see through them. The ride was a maze of mirrored corridors and shifting lights. At first, it was exhilarating, but soon the reflections began to move independently, their smiles too wide and their eyes too bright. Mia grabbed Sam's arm. "This doesn't feel right," she whispered. Sam tried to reassure her, but his own reflection winked at him, and he felt a chill run down his spine. When they finally exited the Labyrinth of Lights, the carnival had changed. The lively crowd was thinner now, and the laughter and music seemed muted. Performers stood motionless, their painted smiles frozen in place. The air felt heavier, and the fog crept closer, blurring the edges of the tents. "Where is everyone?" Mia asked, her voice shaking. Sam didn't have an answer. He tried to lead them back to the entrance, but the path twisted in ways it hadn't before. Every turn brought them back to the center of the carnival, where the towering Ferris wheel loomed, its lights flickering ominously. They found the ringmaster waiting beneath the Ferris wheel, his crimson coat immaculate despite the damp fog. His sharp smile hadn't wavered. "Leaving so soon?" he asked, his tone mocking. "What's going on?" Sam demanded. "Where is everyone?" The ringmaster chuckled. "The carnival has its rules. Those who enter must play, and those who play must stay, unless they can win their freedom." "Win?" Mia repeated, her voice barely above a whisper. He gestured to the carnival games, which now looked far more sinister. The ring toss featured hoops of fire. The shooting gallery had targets that moved with unnatural speed, and the dunk tank held a shadowy figure that writhed beneath the water. "Beat 3 games," the ringmaster said, "and you're free to go." With no other choice, Sam and Mia began their challenge. The first game was the shooting gallery. Sam aimed carefully, but the targets darted and twisted, evading his shots. He managed to hit just enough to pass, but his arms felt heavy, as though the effort had drained more than his strength. Mia's turn was at the ring toss. The fiery hoops burned her hands as she threw the rings, but her determination carried her through. By the time she succeeded, her palms were blistered and her face was pale. The final game was the House of Echoes. A maze of sound and shadow. They entered together, their footsteps echoing unnaturally loud. Voices whispered around them, taunting and pleading. Shadows flitted just out of sight, and the walls seemed to close in. When they finally emerged, the ringmaster was waiting, his smile wider than ever. "Congratulations," he said, clapping slowly. "You've won." The carnival around them began to fade, the tents collapsing into mist and the lights flickering out. The ringmaster tipped his hat. Until next time. Sam and Mia found themselves back in the empty field, the fog lifting as dawn broke. The posters had vanished, and there was no sign the carnival had ever been there. But as they walked away, they each felt a strange weight in their pockets. Pulling them out, they found 2 tickets, the words "Admit One" written in gold. The date was blank, but the message was clear. The carnival wasn't finished with them yet. Story 8. Nestled in the heart of a dense forest, Blackwater Lake shimmered like a dark jewel. The locals avoided it, whispering tales of a shadow that lived beneath its surface. The legend spoke of a creature, neither human nor beast, that claimed the lake as its own. Every few years, someone would disappear near the water, and their belongings would wash ashore days later, damp and untouched. When Ellie and her friends arrived at the lake for their weekend getaway, they laughed at the warnings from the nearby townsfolk. "It's just a story to scare kids," Jake said, unloading their camping gear. Ellie, however, couldn't shake the unease that crept over her as she stared at the still black water. Something about the lake felt wrong, as if it were watching them. The first night was uneventful. The group set up camp, roasted marshmallows over a crackling fire, and shared ghost stories. Jake's voice rose dramatically as he recounted the tale of the shadow beneath the lake. "They say it only comes out at night," he said, lowering his voice to a whisper. "When the moon is high, it rises from the depths to claim another soul." The group erupted into laughter, but Ellie's eyes stayed on the water, where the moonlight created rippling patterns. For a moment, she thought she saw something move just below the surface, a dark shape that vanished as quickly as it appeared. The next morning, the group woke to find Liam missing. His sleeping bag was empty and his boots were gone. They searched the campsite and called his name, but there was no response. The only sign of him was a single damp footprint leading toward the lake. Ellie's heart raced, as they approached the shoreline. The water was calm, reflecting the cloudy sky. Jake waded in a few steps, shouting Liam's name, but there was no sign of their friend. "Maybe he went for a hike," Sarah suggested. Though her voice wavered, Ellie shook her head. "He wouldn't leave without telling us." Desperate to find answers, Jake decided to dive into the lake. Armed with a flashlight and a sense of bravado, he stripped down to his swim trunks and plunged into the icy water. Ellie and Sarah watched nervously from the shore as his light bobbed beneath the surface. Minutes passed, then 10. When Jake didn't resurface, Ellie screamed his name, her voice echoing across the empty lake. Just as she was about to jump in after him, the water rippled violently. Jake emerged, gasping for air and clutching something in his hand. It was Liam's flashlight, its beam flickering weakly. "Something pulled me down," Jake said, his voice trembling. "It's not just a legend. There's something down there." That night, the group huddled around the fire, their laughter replaced by uneasy silence. Jake refused to speak about what he had seen beneath the water, but his pale face and shaking hands spoke volumes. As the firelight flickered, Ellie heard a soft splashing sound. She turned toward the lake, her heart pounding. The water was unnaturally still, yet a dark shape moved beneath the surface, growing larger and closer. "Do you see that?" she whispered. The others followed her gaze, and gasps filled the air as the shape broke the surface. A shadowy figure emerged, its form shifting and flickering like smoke. It had no face, only empty voids where eyes should have been. It raised an arm, and the campfire extinguished with a hiss. Panic erupted as the group ran toward the woods, the shadow gliding silently after them. Ellie stumbled, her foot catching on a root, and she fell hard to the ground. The shadow loomed over her, its presence freezing the air around her. "Ellie, get up!" Sarah screamed, pulling her to her feet. Together, they sprinted toward the car, where Jake was fumbling with the keys. The engine roared to life, and they sped away from the lake, the shadow retreating into the darkness. When they reached the safety of the town, Ellie looked back, her breath coming in ragged gasps. The lake was still visible in the distance, its surface calm and unbroken, but she knew the shadow was still there, waiting for its next victim. Story 9. It began with an envelope. Clara found it slipped under her apartment door, one gray autumn morning. The paper was heavy, cream-colored, and embossed with intricate patterns. Inside was a single note. "You are invited to the unveiling of Willowmere Estate. One night only. Saturday at 8 p.m. RSVP. Not required." Clara had heard whispers about Willowmere, a sprawling mansion on the outskirts of town, abandoned for decades. Local legend claimed it was cursed, its owners disappearing mysteriously over the years. She should have thrown the invitation away, but curiosity got the better of her. On Saturday evening, she drove to the estate, the road winding through dense woods. The mansion loomed ahead, its Gothic spires piercing the darkening sky. The air was thick with the scent of damp earth and decaying leaves. Clara parked her car and approached the grand entrance, its heavy doors already ajar. "Welcome," a voice whispered, though no one was there. Inside, the house was grand but decayed. Chandeliers hung from cracked ceilings, their crystals coated in dust. Faded wallpaper peeled away from the walls, revealing glimpses of wood beneath. Despite its state, the house seemed alive, humming faintly as though it were breathing. Clara wasn't alone. A small group of guests milled about, each as bewildered as she was. There was Victor, a sharp-dressed businessman. Evelyn, a retired teacher with a wary gaze. And Mark, a college student clutching his phone like a lifeline. "Did anyone invite you?" Clara asked the group. They all shook their heads. Each had found the same mysterious envelope. The mood grew tense as they realized none of them knew the host or why they had been summoned. As the clock struck 8, the doors slammed shut with a resounding boom. The guests scrambled to open them, but they wouldn't budge. Victor cursed under his breath while Evelyn muttered a prayer. Mark's phone had lost its signal, the screen stuck on the time. "Maybe it's a prank," Clara suggested, though she didn't believe her own words. The house groaned in response, its timbers creaking like a living thing. The chandeliers flickered to life, casting long, shifting shadows. The air grew colder, and a voice echoed through the hall. "Welcome to Willowmere. You are our guests of honor." The voice instructed them to gather in the dining room. The long table was set with silverware that gleamed despite the grime, covering everything else. Plates of food appeared as if by magic. Roasted meats, steaming vegetables, and desserts that smelled divine. "We should leave," Evelyn whispered. "Maybe we should eat first," Mark said, his stomach growling. Clara hesitated but sat down. The others followed, hunger overpowering their fear. But as they ate, the room began to change. The walls shifted and the air thickened. A low growl echoed from somewhere within the house. Suddenly, Victor choked, his face turning purple. Clara leapt to her feet, but it was too late. He collapsed, lifeless, as the voice returned. "One will fall for each rule broken." Panic set in as the guests fled the dining room, the walls of the house shifting around them. The corridors twisted and stretched, forming an endless maze. Doors appeared and disappeared, some leading to dead ends, others to rooms filled with horrors. A mirror that reflected nothing. A library where books whispered as they opened, and a nursery filled with broken dolls that watched them with unblinking eyes. Evelyn was the next to vanish. She stepped into a room filled with music boxes, their haunting melodies drawing her in. The door slammed shut behind her, and when Clara and Mark managed to pry it open, she was gone. By dawn, only Clara and Mark remained. Exhausted and terrified, they stumbled into the grand hall, where a massive portrait of the mansion's original owner hung. The painted eyes seemed to follow them as the voice spoke again. "One must stay. Choose, or the house will choose for you." Clara and Mark stared at each other, their breaths ragged. Mark opened his mouth to speak, but Clara acted first. She pushed him toward the portrait, the floor beneath him collapsing into darkness. His scream echoed as he disappeared, and the house fell silent. Clara sank to the floor, tears streaming down her face. The doors opened, the morning light spilling in. She staggered out, but as she reached her car, she looked back and realized something chilling. The mansion was gone. Only an empty field remained. Story 10. The old railway tunnel had been abandoned for decades, its entrance overgrown with vines and brambles. For years, it had been a source of local legend in the small town of Darrow's Hollow. Children dared each other to approach it, but few ever ventured inside. The stories spoke of trains that vanished into the darkness, never to emerge again. When Eric and his friends stumbled upon the tunnel during a weekend hike, they couldn't resist exploring. Armed with flashlights and a growing sense of adventure, They pushed past the vines and stepped into the yawning darkness. The air inside was damp and heavy, and the sound of their footsteps echoed ominously. The graffiti-covered walls bore strange symbols, mixed with faded warnings. Turn back. Leave while you can. Eric laughed nervously as he read the messages aloud, but the unease in his voice was clear. It's just an old tunnel, he said, though he gripped his flashlight tighter. As they ventured deeper, the light from the entrance faded, leaving them in near total darkness. The beams of their flashlights danced across the damp walls, revealing rusted tracks and piles of debris. The air grew colder, and a low, distant rumble echoed through the tunnel. "Did you hear that?" Megan asked, her voice trembling. "Probably just the wind," Eric replied. Though he wasn't convinced, the rumble grew louder, and the ground beneath them began to vibrate. A faint light appeared in the distance, growing steadily brighter. It was the unmistakable glow of an approaching train. "There's no way," Chris said, backing toward the wall. "This track hasn't been used in decades." The group huddled against the cold stone as the light surged toward them, but as the train barreled past, it made no sound. The carriages were empty, their windows dark and cracked. Within seconds, the train vanished into the gloom, leaving the group in stunned silence. Shaken but curious, the group pressed on. The tunnel seemed to stretch endlessly, its walls narrowing the further they went. Strange symbols began to appear more frequently, etched into the stone as though burned there. The air grew colder still, and whispers began to fill the silence. The whispers were faint at first, indistinct murmurs that seemed to come from the walls themselves. But as they moved deeper, the voices grew clearer, speaking in a language none of them recognized. Megan stopped abruptly, shining her flashlight on the ground. There in the dirt were footprints that didn't belong to any of them. They were bare, impossibly large, and they led deeper into the tunnel. "We should turn back," she said, her voice barely audible. "We've come this far," Eric argued. "We need to see where it leads." The tunnel opened into a massive underground chamber, its ceiling lost in the shadows above. In the center of the room stood an ancient locomotive, its rusted frame covered in vines and glowing symbols. The train seemed to pulse faintly, as though alive. Chris approached it cautiously, running his hand along its cold surface. "This is insane," he muttered. "How did it get here?" Before anyone could respond, the whispers turned to screams. The symbols on the train flared to life, casting the chamber in an eerie red glow. Shadows began to move at the edges of the light, their forms flickering like fire. "We need to go," Megan said, pulling at Eric's arm, but the tunnel they had come through was gone, replaced by solid stone. The only way out was through the train. Reluctantly, they climbed aboard the locomotive. The interior was just as decayed as the outside, with broken seats and shattered windows. The whispers followed them, growing louder as the train lurched to life. The ride was chaotic. The train hurtled through an endless void, the walls of the tunnel flashing past in streaks of red and black. Outside the windows, shadowy figures kept pace with the train, their hollow eyes watching intently. Eric gripped the seat in front of him, his knuckles white. "What is this?" he shouted over the noise. Megan pointed ahead, her face pale. "Look!" In the distance, a massive doorway loomed, its surface carved with the same symbols that covered the train. As they hurtled toward it, the door began to open, revealing a blinding light. When the train stopped, The group found themselves back at the tunnel's entrance. The sun was rising, casting a golden glow over the forest. The tunnel behind them was silent, its entrance now sealed by a wall of stone. Eric, Megan, and Chris stood in stunned silence, their breaths visible in the cool morning air. None of them spoke as they made their way back to town, each lost in their own thoughts. The whisper stayed with them, haunting their dreams and echoing in quiet moments. And though they never returned to the tunnel, they couldn't escape the feeling that it was waiting for them, deep beneath the earth. Story 11. It was an unassuming mirror, or at least that's what Lydia thought when she bought it at the estate sale. The frame was ornate, gilded with delicate carvings of roses and vines, tarnished with age but beautiful nonetheless. She found it leaning against a dusty wall, overlooked by the other shoppers. "How much for the mirror?" Lydia asked the elderly man running the sale. He glanced at it, his expression tightening. $20, he said quickly, as though eager to be rid of it. Lydia didn't think twice. It was a steal, and she had the perfect spot for it in her living room. But as she handed over the cash, the man added in a low voice, "Be careful where you place it." She laughed nervously. "Why?" He shook his head. "Just don't let it face another mirror." Back home, Lydia hung the mirror above the fireplace. Its reflective surface brought light and depth to the room, and she admired the way it seemed to brighten the space. That night, as she read on the couch, she noticed something odd. The reflection in the mirror seemed off. When she moved, her reflection moved a beat slower, as if lagging behind. She shook her head, blaming her imagination in the dim lighting. The next morning, she found her coffee table books rearranged. She didn't remember touching them. Shrugging it off, she left for work, convinced she was being forgetful. But the unease lingered. A week later, Lydia hosted a small dinner party. Her friends admired the mirror, complimenting her on the find. "It's so vintage," her friend Rachel said. "Where did you get it?" "Estate sale," Lydia replied. "Apparently it's got some kind of spooky history." They laughed, toasting to old superstitions. But later that night, after the guests had left, Lydia sat alone in the living room, staring at the mirror. She couldn't shake the feeling that someone was watching her. The room was silent except for the ticking of the clock. Then she saw it. A flicker of movement in the mirror. Something that didn't match the room. A shadow darted across the surface, vanishing before she could fully register it. Disturbed, Lydia returned to the estate sale, hoping to get answers. The elderly man was gone, replaced by a younger woman who knew little about the sale. "He sold everything and moved," she said. "Didn't say where." Frustrated, Lydia began researching the mirror. She found a few vague mentions online about cursed mirrors that trapped spirits, but nothing concrete. That night, she covered it with a sheet, hoping to silence her growing paranoia. It didn't help. The whispers began at midnight, faint and indistinct. When she pulled back the sheet, the mirror's surface was rippling like water, and a handprint appeared from the other side. Desperate, Lydia tried to get rid of the mirror. She dragged it to her garage, but when she returned to the living room, it was back above the fireplace, hanging as if it had never been moved. Panicked, she called Rachel for help. When Rachel arrived, she brought along her brother, a self-proclaimed paranormal enthusiast. "It's a portal," he said, examining the mirror. "These carvings? They're symbols meant to bind something inside. You didn't face it toward another mirror, did you? Lydia froze. She had briefly leaned it against her hallway mirror while redecorating. That would explain it, he said grimly. You've created a passage. That night, the three of them tried to close the portal. They surrounded the mirror with salt, lit candles, and recited protective chants. At first, it seemed to work. The rippling stopped, and the whispers faded. But as midnight approached, the room grew icy. The candles extinguished themselves, and the mirror began to glow. Figures emerged from its surface, their forms twisted and grotesque. They surrounded the trio, their hollow eyes filled with malice. Rachel screamed as one of the figures lunged at her, pulling her toward the mirror. Lydia grabbed her friend, but the force was too strong. Rachel disappeared into the glass, her scream echoing in the still air. Terrified, Lydia and Rachel's brother fled the house. When they looked back, the mirror was gone, along with the figures. The house was silent. Lydia moved out the next day, but she could never escape the feeling that the mirror was still watching her, waiting for its next victim.